There have been some dramatic events relating to the vote in November, at least as far as Floridians are concerned, because the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, and I'm not saying that ironically, struck down 3 amendments that were supposed to be on the ballot, including 2 that I was originally going to talk about tonight. So that changes things a little bit. Amendment 2 is unfortunately still on the ballot, and this is the one called the Florida Marriage Protection Amendment. And as you see, they offer not only a very specific definition of marriage, but they make it extremely clear, reading the language, no other legal union that is treated as marriage, and this is the most important part, or the substantial equivalent thereof shall be valid and recognized, which means no civil unions, or this will probably also threaten, what's the other term? Long-term marriage. Yeah, common law marriage, which is incidentally not recognized in Florida unless you have a common law marriage from outside of Florida and then come here. But Florida itself does not recognize common law marriage. But it will threaten other things, and we'll talk about this at the end. It's also, in very important ways, different from the other 2 amendments, 7 and 9, even though I'm going to argue, oops, I'm doing it again. Even though I'm going to argue that there are very important separation of church and state issues involved in all 3, and of course that's my main concern, being active in Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Amendment 7 that was struck down was going to change the Constitution of Florida as it exists today. As it exists today, you have, starting with Section 3, religious freedom. There shall be no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting or penalizing the free exercise thereof. So far it sounds like the First Amendment. But the amendment as proposed would remove the section that says no revenue of the state of Florida can go to any religious organization for any purpose. It would remove that and replace it with an individual or entity may not be barred from participating in a public program because of religion. Public program because of religion. It doesn't mention the word money or funds or revenues, but this is what it means. Now, I'm going to come back to this because one of the things that I want to do tonight is not just talk about the amendments themselves, but put it into context. Some of the arguments about the amendments, and I had this experience, which is one of the reasons I started researching this a little bit more deeply than I had before, of encountering arguments that I didn't know where they came from. And then I thought, okay, I better find out about this. You look at it, and the whole argument, both from the side of the forces of light, us, and the forces of darkness, them, are filled with contradictions. And one of the lessons that we have to learn about talking about these amendments, even as we oppose them, and now what remains is Amendment 2, we have to be very careful about the kinds of arguments that we make and the kinds of outcomes that we are hoping to achieve. Amendment 9, it was a long amendment. I don't know how many of you tried to read the amendment as it actually was. I just have a summary up here. But it was long and confusing and complicated, and it wasn't really clear what they were getting at. But the summary essentially says this was going to say that all students in Florida deserve an education, free public education, and then it placed stipulations on how public schools would spend their budgets. Nothing about how private schools would spend their budgets, but all sorts of interesting twists of phrase that implied private schools were going to be getting public money. So it was doubly bad because if you read it in good faith, unless you were a lawyer, you would have a hard time figuring it out. And B, it was placing restrictions on how public schools could spend the money they would get from the state without saying anything about what private schools would have to do. And there were all sorts of other things we can get into, but it was what we would call a stealth amendment. That is to say, it claimed to be doing one thing, demanding rigor from the schools so that they would provide good education and use public funds properly. But in fact, it was the voucher amendment. This was going to let vouchers in the back door, and that's what it was all about. Now, all three of these amendments have problems with language. And in fact, the three amendments that were thrown out, I didn't talk about 5. 5 was also a screwball amendment, had problems with language, and all of the justices talked about that. That's why numbers 5 and 9 were thrown out. It's not why number 7 was thrown out, apparently. But nevertheless, the justices all commented on how the language was misleading, and they were even hinting that in the future they might make stricter rules about how amendments should be worded and named. But we'll get to that. 2 of these amendments were thrown out. 2 of these were amendments that were thrown out by the Supreme Court. The fact that they were thrown out by the Supreme Court also adds a dimension to trying to understand the constitutions. The Supreme Court has a role to play here as outlined in the Constitution. Needless to say, if you read any of the blogs, people from the forces of light think, oh, wow, great, our Supreme Court did its job, etc. And people from the forces of darkness were saying, get rid of the Supreme Court and let the people decide, even though the people would not have been able to understand 2 of the 3 amendments as they were printed. And that was deliberate, at least on the part of some of the supporters. What I wanted to do, I'm not at first, I'm going to get to it, I'm not at first going to give a straightforward sort of stump speech about why you should vote against Amendment 2 and why you should beware of future attempts to bring back 7 or 9, because that's going to happen. What I want to talk about a little bit is constitutions themselves, what they're supposed to do, and why we should be more educated about the constitutions altogether, and then in parentheses, why we should all be constantly on our guards about what's going on and participate. I think this group is probably a group that participates a lot in the political process. But nevertheless, we always have to remain on our guard. But we have to understand how the constitutions work, why the constitutions are the way that they are, what they're for, and then what is right and wrong with our constitutions. And then we can talk about the amendments. And again, I'm not going to talk that much about 7 and 9 because, at least temporarily, they've been taken out. But we do have to talk about them to a certain extent.